my transcription isn't so bad. It's mostly
I think it's working already.
Yeah. So like I'm okay here, but
Do you know, Christina, if it streams, does it upload during that time period, or is it in the next?
Immediately.
It is, so it's mostly immediately there.
Yes.
Okay, well that's, maybe we should work.
Well, it's actually pretty, like once
I sent a file that explains
I
how
feel
to
like
use it.
it's not that bad as I thought, and like
Didn't
I'm mostly worried about falling asleep.
No, I
Like,
thought
think it's like the
I thought you
being
sent,
very
I saw an email that said there are programs which, there are apps
yeah.
which help you do
Yeah,
it.
that's it.
But that's not telling you step by step what to do.
Oh, but then you have the other file that I sent
That's
to
where,
you.
yeah, so I'm like just carrying around both my
Okay, I
glasses
didn't-
and
which tells me step by step
Yes.
what to do.
Yeah.
Just fine, like
Using, that is, using a separate app or using just the YouTube?
A separate app.
Separate app, okay. Okay, well, okay, so that's,
Yeah, it was done before. That's why I didn't bother about doing it again.
yeah, I guess I was trying to ask first, what if we try to use it on YouTube? Because I think that's what we've been doing, isn't it?
No,
Or what-
I have
what-
always
what-
been using the same app.
You have a separate app?
Yes,
I see.
Wirecast.
Oh, so, okay, so I've just been using the YouTube built-in stuff. Okay.
I don't know how to use that.
Okay.
The other one's much easier.
Okay. And is it clear what the name of the app is that you were using? Because you sent me 2 or 3.
It's only a 30 page.
That's
For Apple, it's very clear. For Android, I don't know. I don't know which one. I saw like a couple of suggestions online.
But you have an iPhone.
Yes.
So that's the one you're using.
Yes.
It had only one for iPhone?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, it
okay,
did.
okay, now that's why I was confused.
We'll already have a draft by
Because
the end of this
I saw
quarter.
Android
For the
and all
most
these
part,
options, so.
it's like a 10 to 25 page final for this quarter, so I'm like, but like I'm still kind of like, I don't know.
Good time.
I know.
Mine like even though.
Okay, just getting ready, we can do Q&A on what I talked about, because I talked the whole time last time. And we want some Q&A on scenescapes and some of the themes we raised. Then we can talk about the arts, including some of the last readings that are more on the arts. Then we've got Whitney, who because one of you asked about gentrification. Whitney has said Whitney's MA is on gentrification. Let's get her to tell us what's going on. So she's got some new things on gentrification. And then fourth, we have how many of you looked at the video by Theaster Gates called 7 Principles of Ethical Redevelopment? 1. Okay, so maybe we'll show just a little of that, give you an idea of Theaster Gates. He's a cool dude, and he's doing interesting things. Okay, and it's a concrete Chicago policy-oriented South Side example that illustrates the bigger principles of scenescapes and all kinds of stuff. Okay, so that's our agenda. First, think of some questions. Think of some a little discussion around scenes and scenescapes and stuff like that. And a little, and maybe how does this work in China? How might this work in another location? I want to have a YouTube. I got it in my I think that's all it needs is to plug that in. If it's working, we've got the screen down, we got the light. Okay, great. So up here I can turn that light off. Okay, then press this again. Okay, showed you a map last time as well. Red and blue states in the US where sometimes art was more important and then other jobs are more important. That map was made by, guess who? Christina Sakamoto, who's our teaching assistant last quarter and who's doing a PhD in sociology on what she's calling the chicken and egg problem. That is, when do the arts drive jobs and when do jobs drive the arts? And how to capture those dynamics, each of those dynamics. Then we're going to want that light a little lower, so we don't want the second to the bottom. If we find the bottom here, it's going to be quite, wow, that's very dark. Okay, if we go to second to bottom, and then try, no, that's not working. Third from the bottom, fourth, top. That light's coming on, but we don't have PG2. Should be coming on now, it says. Plugged in. Q&A while we're getting our tech stuff going. Oops, let me turn this one on. Okay. Discussion. Scenescapes. Ideas, general ideas, not just the book, but the bigger ideas that it tries to address. There we go. Okay. Here's a reminder. But what if we ask Christina just to say a word or two about this and sort of your work going on as a lead-in to thinking about some of these issues?
That map considers the neighbors to start, so keep that in mind. And it shows where the arts are hotter in the red areas and colder in the blue areas in the US. So that's a basic hot spot map that shows the high concentrations of something as opposed to like lower concentrations. Yellow is not significant. The darker the color is, more significant that concentration is. So the darker red means 99% confidence that that area has high concentrations of arts or higher values of something. In this case, number of arts jobs.
Okay. Excellent. I mean, that's a great non-technical summary of these points, that the arts are active drivers of jobs in the whole economy in the red areas. So it's not as if the question, that is, don't, as you've heard me say more than once, don't ask, is this true? Ask where and why is this more true or less true? That is, where and why do the arts make more of a difference and why might they decline in significance? And then think maybe of how this might work in China or another place, or Guangdong compared to Beijing, as you're thinking about variations inside China. So I recently reviewed a paper that compared, I think something like 100 neighborhoods in one Chinese city. And it compared the factors in the West to the factors in Chinese cities, which tended to generate, what was the dependent variable? I think it was the growth of the arts. What generates arts jobs and arts activity? And it may have been the other way, but the point is, the arts jobs in this Chinese city were related not only to some of the factors that we find in the West, such as education, help me, Christina, say a couple of the basic things that art jobs are positively related to.
Income,
Yeah, okay.
population.
Yeah, and so I mean, you used income, education, education, occupation, income as when they are higher, then you tend to get more of the red pattern, for instance. But not always. And so what was interesting in this Chinese paper was it added some specific things which were not so significant, at least in past studies. They included photography shops. They included railroad stations. They included, I think, maybe bus stations, maybe Chinese tea houses, and something else like that. That is, there was more public, compared to the West, and especially the U.S., the idea of a bus station, of a train station, of people coming and going, and thus lots of people going by a site, makes that site attractive if you're trying to sell your pictures, your photographs, your paintings, your art, and so forth. And so artists tended more in this, at least in this city in China, to congregate near these kinds of things, as well as, but sometimes, and this is what we've also found, sometimes they are not, and this is how we get to Whitney. They are not in the high income neighborhoods. And we had from, is it Dan Katz?
Weiss.
Dan Weiss, okay. I mean, Dan has had 4 postings, and your last one is asking about, why don't you ask your question, fold this in. About
Calumet or about Southside?
No, the last one, I think it's just today. Didn't you have a follow-up about,
I don't remember which one it was. Sorry.
Well, artists being priced out of a neighborhood. Maybe that's what okay, maybe I'm confusing with something else. Okay, that's the big theme in the Rich Lloyd book. Who's looked at the Rich Lloyd book? Okay, a little bit. Let's fold that in with Whitney. So okay, we're covering multiple themes, but I'm covering, in a sense, I'm drawing from these multiple studies quickly to say how and why is China different from the West. So I'm running through in my mind a set of variables, and I'm saying China may be different in the sense that there may be more heavy use of trains, buses, and maybe photography shops, which may not have been used so much in the other studies. But more generally, I'd say the main point is the basic methods, the basic approach, the basic way of thinking was virtually identical in the Chinese city than if the researcher were in Germany or France or the US. That is, you don't need to say, China is unique. Nothing from Korea or Japan or Germany works in China. We need new rules, new theory, and nothing from abroad will work. And nobody outside China can ever read us. That's an old Chinese perspective. But on the fact that 2 of you, 3 of you are here, 4 of you are here from China, and then China is now sending hundreds of thousands of young scholars, PhD students, professors on sabbatical and so forth to come to the West, says maybe the Chinese and the Western people can learn from each other and we can all be more informed. But some things are about China, other things are really not. That is, in some ways, China in this study, I would say the main thing was that some of the specific findings were a little bit different. But the methodology, the theorizing, the approach could just as well have been used in a non-Chinese location. Is another more general point which I wanted to make. Is some of you, especially 2 of you, have just arrived from China, and you know the arguments as to why you cannot, why China is different. Okay, we've talked a bit about that. All right. And I say China, but in France, they say France. In Argentina, they may say Argentina is different. Latin America is different. Or the third world is different from the first world, and so forth. Okay. That is, if we have data, and we have specific analyses in the third world, in China, in Argentina, then compare them concretely to England, Germany, US, France, then we can say where and why are they specifically different. That becomes interesting. Instead of just saying it can't be done. If you say it can't be done, but you don't try, you don't know. Okay. Try. That's what we've been doing. 1 point. Okay. Second bigger point. I don't want to lecture more. I mainly want to see if we can draw out any thoughts. That is, sometimes one or two of you have been posting and talking and asking questions, but in general, you are more quiet as a class than in the past. Now, most classes these years are getting more quiet, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I would have a hard time talking in class. Students would be, how about this, how about that, so forth. So don't be afraid to ask or suggest a leading question or say, how about this? Or how might it change something? I'm answering in a sense the question, how might it be different in China? Where are you from?
I'm from Old Lyme, Connecticut.
Old Lyme, Connecticut. Okay. Tell us a little more about Old Lyme and how might any of this apply to Old Lyme?
It's a very small town. There's about 6,000 people. It's fairly rural, actually.
Where is it within Connecticut?
It's on the shoreline.
And near what?
It's kind of near London.
Okay. Good.
My town definitely has a big art space, so I kind of connected to that
A
whole
little bit louder, please, so we can pick it up and people listening tomorrow can hear you. It has a definite art space in Old Lyme, Connecticut.
Yeah, like in the 1900s, it was an artist colony.
Okay.
I'd say that's still a big part of the town's identity. There's now an arts college there. I mean, it's not a very exciting place, but.
You lived there all your life?
I lived there for about 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah,
Okay.
for high school.
Okay. Did you go to high school there?
Yeah.
Lots of artists or aesthetically oriented people?
Maybe more than the average.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Did that shift any of your ways of looking at city streets or buildings or people or whatever else? Or that is not just you, but people in the high school. That is, if you go back and forth to Chicago or different neighborhoods or whatever. That is, I ask because I would say, when I first came to Chicago, nobody seemed to look at the streets. They were dirty, there were potholes, there was mud. That is, in 19th century American cities they were not paved. They had mud everywhere. And so they whereas, and dirty, even if they were paved. Paris, the streets, when I first went there as a student, wow, these streets are clean. They're out there blowing them, hosing them down with water twice a day. Then it got too expensive to do that, and they got a little bit dirty. Then the next generation was figuring out high-tech ways to to use water to clean the streets, and the Parisians now do that, and the streets are fantastically clean again. So, that is the sensitivity to cleanliness of the street, the colors, the shapes, the ways these things put together. You pay more attention to if you have an artistic eye. Now, the part of the general argument is people are increasingly doing this in looking at scenes and looking at scenes in the many ways that we've used that term in the book. That is, anything could be a scene. This classroom is a scene if we look at it in that way. And if we say, what's the localism of this classroom? How are people neighborly? How are people, is anybody transgressive? How can we see any of that? Are people glamorous? How can we see that? So you can look for those dimensions in a classroom with photographs. And there's a guy who did a PhD in Seoul, Korea, taking photographs of an artistic neighborhood and other neighborhoods in Seoul. Then later on, he went to China, to the I think the city of Dalian, and there's a Korean neighborhood in Dalian, China. So he compared the Korean neighborhood in Dalian, China, with the Chinese Dalian streets in terms of what they seem to think of as glamour, in terms of transgressiveness, in terms of localism. So he looked for all of these 15 dimensions and contrasted China, Koreatown, and within China, and China and Korea within Seoul. And there are 3 different sets of photographs. Yeah.
Why didn't he look at like Chinatown within Seoul?
What? A little louder?
Why didn't he look at Chinatown in Seoul as well? Did he look into the picture?
I don't know if there is a Chinatown in Seoul. Anybody from Korea know? That is, at least he didn't write about it. I mean, that is. We think there's a Chinatown in all big American cities. Maybe there probably is in some way, shape, or form.
Well, I lived there.
Oh, you did? Okay. Well, so you know them. All right. So tell us.
Well, I mean, it was so long ago, I really can't.
Yeah. It was what?
It was so long ago that I can't speak.
Okay, but you remember there was a Chinatown in Seoul.
I think so.
Okay. Or put differently, if we look for measures, and Christina's doing, one of her themes is global citizenship, and she's talking about how can we measure global citizenship and how much people in Seoul are globally cosmopolitan versus being just Korean. And one of the measures we have is of about is the different kinds of restaurants they have in in Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing, and as well as nationally in other locations. The thing we did was to say, inside China, how many Korean restaurants are there and Japanese restaurants? Then inside Korea, how many Chinese and Japanese? And inside Japan, how many Chinese and Korean restaurants? Yeah.
I'm sorry, did you look at other types of restaurants besides, like, I guess, more Asian continent ones? Or was it, like, more of a focus on, like, Pan-Asian citizenship?
For these purposes, we only had rich data for these 3 countries. So, I mean, it takes a lot of time and money to get get thousands and thousands of restaurants, and or to go and take all the photographs. It's a good PhD's worth amount of work. We did. That is what we had. The data we had within those 3 countries and those 3 cities were whatever kinds of restaurants they went to in those 3 cities. So if there were Indian or Indonesian or Thai restaurants, they would have turned up. But the point is, those generally were too small to appear within Beijing. And as I recall, the Chinese, even though the Chinese spend a lot of time in restaurants. The #1 thing the Chinese take photographs of is food after it's served and before it is eaten, when it's beautifully presented on the tray. And so we had, it links with family solidarity, with reinforcing neighborliness and localism of the family and integration in that way, as it does in Ireland or Italy or other places, or Italian neighborhoods within and ethnic groups within the U.S. 1. But 2, lots of time in restaurants, but what kind? The answer is mostly Chinese restaurants. However, the variation, that is the cosmopolitanism in China, comes from Sichuan, that is about 15 different types of domestic Chinese food. So these were much more elaborated in the big cities I think we really we had both Beijing data, but then also the 20 largest Chinese cities. So there are more kinds of regional Chinese restaurants, plus fish restaurants, seafood restaurants, and so forth. But not very many Japanese or Korean restaurants. By contrast, Tokyo and Seoul had many, many more Chinese restaurants and foreign restaurants than did the Chinese cities. Now, a proud Chinese answer is, well, of course, Chinese food is better, so everybody should want to eat Chinese food. Maybe so, but at least you can at least compare and see how much so that seems to vary from place to place. So Christina, that is, who's looking at for measures of global citizenship, you want to either think out loud or comment a little bit on any measures like that which you've explored with?
Yeah. So we're going to combine number of types of restaurants in U.S. zip codes, and for those we have like over 100 types. And then we also have religious institutions, and those are about 40 types. And then we were
like
also going
Baptist, Catholic, Methodist,
yes,
and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's a study a study on the types of restaurants that said that a place, in order to have a developed restaurant market, it needs to have a basic package of restaurants, of types of restaurants. And then it starts...
Why don't you come up for a minute, just so you'll be on the video for people who are not here today, then they can see you
Okay.
talking a little bit.
Okay. I don't know if you saw that study.
I'm not sure.
They've been shift. Yeah. Jonathan Dingle suggested that to me, and so in order for a place to have if a place has a restaurant market, it will have like the basic ones first. So fast food and pizza and Italian and Chinese, whatever, and only then they will start having like fusion restaurants and something more innovative. So like a city like Chicago is getting like the second 3 Michelin star restaurant, So maybe we are able to have 2 3 Michelin stars because we have all the other basic package. But in my analysis, it's not that simple. Like there is kind of like a basic package, but for example, nationally, fast food is number 1. In Chicago, it's not that high. So we have more family restaurants in Chicago. So
that's important. I mean, that's an indicator of Catholicism and familism closer to China. That's more like the Chinese or Italian pattern.
Yes, bars and grills and family restaurants, they are more. And another thing I noted is that in the ethnic type of restaurants, the U.S. has more Chinese and then Mexican, but Chicago is the opposite. We have more Mexican restaurants here and then Chinese. So that reflects the population that we have here. Okay. And also that Chinese food is basically American food now and it's everywhere. We can see that some ethnic restaurants are kind of detached from their ethnicity and like more popular, while other ethnicities, like I think German restaurants are something like they are more to do with the population that lives in a place. Yeah.
We quickly calculated the number of, say, Italian, French, German, Chinese restaurants divided by the number of Chinese, French living in that zip code. And we had one simple finding that's easy and interesting to report. Which kind of restaurant or which kind of ethnic group had the most concentration of restaurants and people living together? So that you had a more, let's say, closed neighborhood. Italian. So I've interviewed Italians and talked to them about this and said, of course, only kind of restaurant I ever go to is Italian. And so, that fits our data, not 100%, but that is the Italians living in a neighborhood with Italian restaurants ratio is very high, whereas all the others are much lower. So, and this is across the whole US, but there are variations. So this is more true in Chicago and Boston. It is much less true in California. In California, ethnicity is less salient generally, except perhaps from Mexico. Yeah.
So how about the fact that a neighborhood like Hyde Park, which doesn't have much fast food, I mean like Harold's kind of like, but like they just put in the Nella, which has like a Neapolitan ranking, like how might that fit what you guys are talking about? Or not?
Maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe not, yeah.
That is the main problem with Hyde Park is it's too small.
Okay.
That is it may be that it doesn't have enough restaurants. On the other hand, I was in Madison or in the middle of the main street in Madison, I noticed there was a restaurant that said Afghan food. So Afghanistan, how many, where would you find a small town with an Afghan restaurant? Most likely a college town like Madison, rather than a traditional rural American farm Midwestern place. So in that sense, even if you just have one, if it's something like Afghan, that speaks pretty loud. On the other hand, ideally you have 50, 200, 300 restaurants, and then you can begin to talk about the mix or the type. So that is in general making statements like this. We can talk about Madison or Hyde Park, but you're generally better off if you say Chicago, or let's say, I shouldn't say Chicago necessarily. I'm simply saying if we say college towns, we can compare more of them. If you've got more cases, then you get less measurement error, which is sort of random noise. So if there's one restaurant in Madison, maybe maybe nobody goes there, maybe it's losing money, and maybe it's subsidized by one owner who wants to have it, even if nobody goes there. We don't know. Whereas if you have one of these, that is, if these are concentrated much more heavily in college towns, then that tells you something about the type of and maybe the that is the especially when we have wars going on between Americans and Afghanistan, this leads to a potentially political statement. Okay.
And that's so true that one common restaurant type in Brazil is Lebanese restaurants and like Middle Eastern, and you have like many of them. And we even have a fast food chain that is everywhere and it's based on Arabic food, and we call it Arabic food. Okay, we're not afraid of. And then I came to Chicago and I wanted some, Arabic food because I was used to it. Can't find it. Cannot find it.
They have different names, but the absence of the label speaks.
Say something about it.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
At least in the U.S. it's because Arabic won't sell probably.
Arabic what?
Won't sell to the American population.
Yeah, sure. But the question is why?
Arabic.
Yeah. We're getting into why.
Yes.
Why or why not? Okay. Yeah.
I guess also like a similar thing to think about with that is that there's a lot of Central American food in Chicago, but specifically my mom's from Nicaragua, so I look for Nicaraguan food, and they don't have here and maybe it's because there's like a surplus of very similar foods, and obviously there's not the like demographic to support it. Maybe there's not enough people from that country, but like I wonder how much that comes into play, at least with like Lebanese food and like.
No, for sure. There in a sense there are two models. There's the model of people from that ethnic group support their own restaurant, but the other one is that people who are seeking a different kind of experience look for interesting tastes. So Christina does not have an Arabic background, but she likes Arabic food because she had it in Brazil. And so in that sense, sometimes people teasingly say the way to look for the good restaurants in Chinatown is to count the number of Jews who are there. So the Jews are a measure of sophisticated cuisine folks who go to the better Chinese restaurant. That's a crude kind of indicator, but it's an example of my more general point of that is she's trying to get more generally, not just at a name like Jewish or Chinese, but cosmopolitanism, global, and to capture that in religious institutions, through restaurants, and through other kinds of things, and to see where and how these are changing the makeup of cities. Okay, any more related to this on global stuff for me or Christina? Yeah.
Back to like the whole like Korean food in China idea. What about like the North Korean restaurants that are in China, particularly to like launder money? Like would those be filtered out of such a survey since they're not really intended for culinary purposes?
I mean, if they're open and they're serving and they're counted, I mean, they should appear just like any other. That is the source that the Chinese used, collaborators, is mainly Di Vu, did a PhD on this. He downloaded from a major sort of ranking of restaurants that the Chinese used, which is analogous to Yelp or Facebook or something like that. So we have a new team that's working on Facebook sites created by restaurant owners or by different kinds of business owners. We started with cafes and restaurants, and they've got lots of information on them. They talk about the kind of place we're in, the neighborhood, the feel, and so you get some interesting variations even from what's right there. But if you do a download as we did in France, we downloaded all of this stuff, all of a certain category, and if you get a big enough category, you should get all the restaurants of every background. And then often you can download the actual name and the street address of the individual restaurant. So if you wanted to, you could recode and differentiate between a Starbucks and a Caribou Coffee or a if you knew the name, if you had a name that would tell you it's North Korean. That is, it may not say North Korean restaurant. It may have, it may be called Joe's Skillet or something. But if you have a way of coding, then it should. That is the fact that it's. I guess the point. If you're asking about laundered money, the way we're talking about it shouldn't make any difference. That is, we don't know where the money came from. If that's the sort. Did we have another? Yes, sorry.
I was gonna ask, like, can you look at like restaurants as like a uniform measure of like cosmopolitanism around the world? Would you say like someone, in one part of the world would identify restaurants as kind of like a
just a little louder. Yeah, are restaurants similar around the world?
No, not
analogous.
restaurants are similar around the world, but the way people perceive them as markers of like globalization or whatever.
Sure. Our null hypothesis was that every country would be different, especially China. So we worked with our Chinese visitors who were here from China and a Chinese American, and we gave them a list of dimensions, the 15 scenes dimensions. We had the same coding procedures, about a 40-page coding manual that we'd used. Maybe you were involved in doing this when we did it, when Whitney was helping us work on this stuff. And so we held our breath, and we asked the Chinese to say, take things like and so we took the amenities they had in Beijing, restaurants, museums, temples, etc. And how would you code each of these in terms of the five-point high, somewhat positive, neutral, nothing at all, slightly negative, very negative. Just those 5 points on all of the 90 or so amenities, types of amenities which they had in Beijing. So they used the same general ideas, and they coded the Chinese amenity, they cut the Chinese labels. And to our surprise, they were identical to those in the West, except for the regional food. That is, they had many more types, as I mentioned, many more types of Sichuan and other Chinese regional foods, which simply were not available, not included in the Western. But the point is, people, if a temple is a temple is a temple, that is, it's not saying how many do you have. It's not saying is it good or bad. It's not saying are you rich or poor if you go there. It's simply saying what is a temple. Is a temple glamorous? No. Is a temple familistic? Or does it, maybe it doesn't speak to some kind. That is, the simple point, or put differently, salt. Think of salt and saltiness. Is food salty or not? Okay. Or sugary, sweet. So for Italians and Americans and Chinese, if you say is it sweet or is it salty, those are perceived in pretty much the same ways in China, in Italy, or the US. However, Americans like more sweet and a little more salty. The Italians like less sweet. But they agree on what is sweetness.
So you were having like a lot of people code these things and say whether or not they thought, what level of,
Yeah, but our approach was not to try to have a large number and not tell them what sweetness meant, but to take a small number and then compare exactly and then talk through where it been, and then because we were also things like transgressiveness, glamour, that is, we wanted them to be clear and consistent in their application of the concepts. So we focused on having, so we did use a statistical measure of the intercorrelation matrix with dozen or so people. We compared them to one another, and as if each one individual was quite different from all the rest, we'd then all meet together. Or if there were, if one question or one dimension was different from the others, we would all meet. This is what took the hours and hours and hours over more than a year. We try to understand why one coder gave it a different score. And we talked long enough that we would then add more material to the coder's manual to make it clear so everybody could at least do it consistently.
So does that imply that if you took, did it with a large group of people, the results would be similar?
Probably, but the normal approach is crowdsourcing. You have thousands of people do it, but you don't know what's in their heads, and you don't know if they spend. That is, we would train several weeks having people read and talk about. I mean, I'm trying to have you talk about now these scenes and other concepts, and you're not being very active. So I don't know what's in your heads. That is, so until you have these things clear in your heads, you can't use the concepts. That's the problem. Or you just get, a naive natural language usage, which is nothing wrong with it, but it's not necessarily consistent from one person to the next unless you articulate more what do you mean by X.
I have a quick question because in this class we've mentioned like the concepts like the arts, the restaurants, and something like the globalization and something like that. But actually, I want to know, like, is that within the same system, or are you talking about like different questions? Because in the beginning of the class, we saw the picture of like the chicken and egg problem of the jobs and the arts, and then we are now talking about the restaurants. So are they in the same framework, or are they just different questions before we can talk about China?
Ideally, we would have the same framework, and we would try to apply it with consistent measures and procedures in different locations, Madison, Wisconsin, Beijing, Paris, and then see how the results change from one to the next.
Okay,
so we're not saying every place is identical. We're saying places are different. We know they're different. But we want to measure how are they different by using the same measuring stick. So you have to have the same measuring stick, meters, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, 3. If you don't have the same consistent measuring stick, then you can't tell if they're bigger or smaller.
Okay, so we're now only
so the measuring stick is what I'm talking about when I say sweetness or salty or glamorous.
So we're actually talking about whether any places are identical or not, or
every place is unique. In the world, every city, every person is unique in some combination, some way, but they still can be closer or further from one another on different dimensions. The question is which dimensions and how do we capture them?
Okay.
That's the nitty-gritty.
So do you count the distribution of restaurants as the phenomenon of arts, or? Okay,
I mean the question implicitly you're saying sort of what's art, and I guess we've looked at that with I spent a year reading from Aristotle to present. You know, what is art and what are aesthetics? And so you have periods, names, types, and themes. But as you look at this over time, and a guy who's done a big book on this is Larry Norman. He's now giving lectures on this. He's head of he's a vice president for the arts for the universities, and he works on classicism and romanticism. And because these are bigger, more abstract concepts than just Greek or French, and they're close to part of what we're talking about. But I'd say, so that's one idea, is to distill from the individual discussions of Monet versus Gauguin versus Raphael the names of a painter, some more general concepts such as linearity or whatever, and then to things like classicism or romanticism. That's one way to go. The second way to go is to say it's not the painting, it's not the name of the it's what's in your head. And so that's more of what we do. That is, so when I said we can look at this classroom and we can think of it in economic terms of, you know, how much does it cost to put in the seats. We can look at it in color terms. What are the colors of the chairs next to the rug? We can then look at it in aesthetic terms. Do I like that combination of colors, and why do I like it? What is the aesthetic judgment in that question of why do I like? So I can say I like similar things that are close to one another in their color and hue, or I like things which have a complementarity, but which complementarities? And so examining that kind of, these things of complementarity, color, hue, these are aesthetic judgments. So the general point is, when I say the arts are on the rise, more specifically we're suggesting that the aesthetic judgment, the aesthetic types of judgments are on the rise in choosing restaurants, in choosing clothes, in choosing books, in choosing jobs. So that is, 50 years ago, if you would do many studies, you would generally see the job drives migration. People go to the job. And people were poor, everybody was poor, there was less money. The idea was jobs are so important, you'll move, you'll change your life, you'll do different things, anything for the job. Okay, now we have far more jobs and we have much more talented people, like in this classroom. You can choose. So when I gave you the choice, would you take a job where you're paid $100,000 in the small town in North Dakota, or half that, $50,000 to be in Chicago, New York, and LA? And what did you all say? All except three or four, you all said, I'll give up the $50,000. I want to be in New York, Chicago, and LA. That's an aesthetic judgment. That the lifestyle, I like the lifestyle more than that is, I will give up half of my income to achieve those aesthetic concerns. Okay, does that fit together? Okay, yes?
I guess this kind of relates, I think it's a step away from like the Anglo-global like cosmopolitanism, but I was starting to think, I guess, of arts and entertainment. I was thinking of like sports and like team cities, and when it's the city.
It's close. I mean,
yeah, and
when
a city and its government and like its decisions on how to spend the money, and that kind of affected the reverse. So like in Miami, they built several years ago, they took down the Orange Bowl and they rebuilt the Marlins Stadium. As far as I could tell, like as someone who lives there, like because the Marlins aren't a very good team, and there's a lot of like mixed feelings about it because it's owned by someone who's in New York. So like there's been a lot of things that like, you know, people aren't, even though people are fans of them because it's a home team, like a lot of people don't care for them. And you know, the Orange Bowl is like a meaningful thing to Miami, and you know, people like my dad.
These are aesthetic judgments, you see,
yeah.
of types and degree of localism. See that one team is not really local; it's owned by a New Yorker and so forth. So,
yeah.
so I mean, so all of these are excellent examples of aesthetic judgments applied to sports.
And I guess I was kind of wondering, because it was the kind of the city's decision, and probably, you know, attempt to like bring more tourism or like more economic gain to Miami to like rebuild this, and it ended up kind of backfiring because it took more public money than meant, and it was a whole chaos. But it made me start thinking of like, when it's the city itself and the government that rather than feeding off of maybe like the general public's like, I guess, thoughts on aesthetics and like what their desires are running towards, they're trying to like implement a sort of aestheticism on it. I guess maybe the same, I don't know
Yes.
so much around the Chicago, like Millennium Park, but it was Daley who built it. I don't know what people were thinking about it, they probably didn't like it anyways, but I was thinking about that sort of power dynamic.
So section on what people thought about Millennium Park in
Yeah.
here and in the blue book, the Kentuckyville Karaoke.
Yeah.
It's more in Kentuckyville. That's more in Chicago. This has got Toronto. Toronto is more
Mhm.
featured here. And they have Toronto and Chicago are contrasted. One's top down, the other's bottom up. In Toronto's bottom up for the artists. Okay. Yeah.
But I think
So good points. Yes, these fit and these dovetail with exactly what I'm trying to say. So thank you.
But I think going back to the Marlins
Yeah.
was that so the owner of the Marlins at the time, Jeff Loria, he used to own another team called the Montreal Expos, and he wanted to relocate them forever, and eventually he managed to do that. But as part of the deal, like there was some weird ownership swap, and he owned the Marlins instead. So I think that the city of Miami knew that Jeff Loria just didn't care. There was no sense of like connection to Miami, and those jobs were important, and the idea of having a stadium downtown, that's like the modern trend now. And so they built it, and like I don't think the Marlins really paid that much for it. But nowadays, in order to get there, there's just parking garages, and people leave midway through the game so they don't get stuck in them. There's no transit, and the stadium only seats 30,000 people, so it's not really a big stadium anyway. So I don't
It's
really.
not even downtown though, because it's actually, if anything, it's not from like the sexy part of Miami. It's closer to my neighborhood, which is more residential. It's near touristy area, which is Calle but like it's not in like, you know, they're trying to do the soccer stadium there as well, and like more downtown area. But it was also like a weird place for it to exist. Like it just seemed like a really poor decision because it's like mostly residential around. There wasn't like enough, like I think like kind of like restaurants and things around to support it. So like it was already a weird decision in that like. And yeah, it has just mainly parking lots and like just homes around it. So it didn't seem like it was weird.
Okay. So you're ticking off the sort of classic developmental criteria: transit, proximity, neighborhood, which neighborhood is it in? But then if we add the aesthetics, that is when we say what neighborhood is it in, does the sport or the type of sport or the degree of localism of the team match up well, and how well, with a particular kind of neighborhood, such as a more Italian neighborhood or a more global oriented neighborhood or a sexy neighborhood. What that is, how these differ and why is what is the whole idea, is to help you, to give you some conceptual tools to go beyond the name of one neighborhood in one city and try to say how and why can we compare Beijing to Shanghai to Guangdong to Tokyo, and what are the dimensions that are consistent from place to place. That's what we're trying to do systematically. Okay, Mike, you're next. So you have to
Well, I
talk.
wanted to go along the same lines,
Yeah.
but I wanted to bring it to my hometown where they're trying to move the race.
What's your town?
Tampa.
Tampa.
They're trying to move the race stadium from St. Pete, like a really nice Tropicana field where it is, like I think to downtown Tampa, or like somewhere like within the limits of Tampa. And I was wondering, like it kind of goes along with the theory of like moving it to like almost a better location. But I was wondering, people go to St. Pete for the beach, but the baseball stadium definitely draws a lot of people in. So I was thinking, what might that do? And it is the Tampa Bay Rays, it's not the St. Pete Rays, but it is like the Tampa Bay area. And what might that do to the city of St. Pete by taking the stadium out to really a place where people come to go to Busch Gardens and like to plenty of other places. Whereas I think that the stadium really does draw a lot of people to St. Pete.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the Tropicana is a strange stadium in the sense that it's very outdated design. Like indoor AstroTurf stadiums just aren't a thing anymore in sports, and the whole sports, like playing is part of it, of course. But if you look at stadiums now, they're just much thicker than they used to be, because part of the stadium is the clubs, the high-end seating, the boxes, and the restaurants and concessions. And so new stadiums, like they're just going to be built. It's not really a matter of if, but it's the placement. I guess the trend now is all the teams want to be downtown, You had the Pistons this year move back from Auburn Hills, which is like 40 miles away from downtown Detroit, back to downtown Detroit. You had the Nets, who played in the Meadowlands for a long time, back to Brooklyn. And it's just a trend of teams that don't want to have people commuting.
But instead of saying it's a trend, we're trying to encourage you to say what drives the trend.
If cities are going to pay for stadiums, why would you play elsewhere?
You're not answering in terms of, you know, a goal or a taste or a preference pattern that you're matching up between the residents and the investors, or something like that. Okay. Well, time is going on. But let's let Whitney maybe introduce some aesthetic or art. She's now an official faculty member at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and so we're fortunate to have her talk here a little bit about some of these. But you also did an MA including Brooklyn as a New York neighborhood, quintessentially changing, driven by the artist. So tell us a little bit about what you want to discuss, and we'll take it from there. Could you come up so we can have you on? Yeah, be careful not to.
Oh no. It's like propped in a weird way.
Good job.
Yeah, so my dissertation research is a comparative study of sound art in galleries and museums, and then sound in music venues and concert halls, and how kind of space and organizational context affect the way that people hear, and also the way that they value what they're hearing. And so I think that's kind of where this maybe comes in, is that space and kind of urban environments change the way that people hear sound and value it. So I was looking back at the Richard Florida. Has everyone read that piece, that paper? I think that's up for this week, right? Richard Florida.
And we just have a few pages to say. There's a whole lot behind this. Book after book after book, websites, interviews. He's tweeting virtually every day with, you know, millions of followers. So he's a major player. So getting a flavor of what and so tell us.
You should look at his website too. His website is really entertaining. I think he's like kind of a star figure, like academia, like pop academia or something. So he has this theory of the creative class, that if creative people are living in cities, that it drives economic development. But there are two different types of those creative people. So it's like the creative, he calls them the super creative core, which are artists, poets, academics, I believe, fit into that category. And then on kind of the periphery of that is the creative professionals, who are people who are doing all kinds of work. So check out the list of professions that he has in there. It's like people doing tech jobs, lawyers, doctors. I forget the long list of creative professionals. These are really two distinct groups, and I think that's a point of maybe critique of his work, because he lumps them together to say that this big sector of the economy is driving economic growth because they're creative people, which is actually 30% of all occupations. So it's kind of an enormous group. And the mechanism that he has, I actually have a note taken over here. His mechanism for that growth is that the super creative core, which are the poets and etc., poets and artists and musicians, people I was studying, produce new forms or designs that are readily transferable and broadly useful, such as designing a product that can be widely made, sold, and used, coming up with a theorem or strategy that can be applied in many cases, or composing music that can be performed again and again. So his mechanism for kind of driving this economic growth is that there's something like generally useful about the arts, not that they're creating aesthetic amenities. And I think there's maybe more evidence for, we've talked about gentrification a bit in here, I've heard, a little bit on the days that I've been here, but I think that pattern is talking more about like aesthetically driven and artistically driven amenities are what are drawing people to these neighborhoods, therefore creating economic growth. It's not necessarily the actual objects they're creating that are these like transferable things, right? If someone's writing a poem, maybe that's not necessarily that transferable, and that's not what's drawing people in, is like, oh, there's this like utility in the poem. It's because they're like a poetic type that are maybe like opening a cafe as well. I don't know. So you have these two proportions, and in my research, this dissertation research, the proportions of these people are kind of opposed to one another, because you have the creative professionals and you have the like creative core. I was interviewing mostly the creative core, but also some professionals who are administrators and people running galleries, working in museums, etc., and also scholars of the arts. So they kind of maybe bleed into the professional side, but I tended to study the creative core, actual like producers, arts producers, and musicians. And they tended to be displaced. So they come into cities where there's cheap rent and where they can make their work and be collaboratively involved. And then we know the gentrification process, so they end up getting pushed out. And the question is, does his model hold after that process starts to turn in a neighborhood? And I think furthermore, is there a bigger process of municipal gentrification? That people move to New York during the early 2000s to make music and art. They get there because the rent is still cheap enough in parts of Brooklyn. Now they can't afford to live there anymore, and maybe they have to move to different cities. So not only moving within cities.
But weren't they part of creating the gentrification? Or like who's
Absolutely, they're part of the turning wheel.
Right,
but
right.
if his theory is that they bring this like aesthetically pleasing, maybe they're creating these objects that are kind of useful for the process, or that they're creating these amenities that are attractive to the creative professionals and the economy at large. What happens when they're out of the picture? Does that process continue, or then what happens? Because then the neighborhood doesn't have that kind of the drawing factors that it did in that first moment of economic development. Yeah.
With drawing factors in terms of the rent that was so low before, or like the actual just draw, like original draw of musicians?
Well, this kind of gets to the scenes concept. It's like the actual presence of people who are doing this really creative work is, he's saying, has some kind of like drawing factor to these neighborhoods. It's not necessarily the rent, although that probably goes hand in hand. And amenities that they're bringing with them, which are galleries and playing in music venues, etc. Yeah. So once those people are then displaced through the economic development that he's saying they created, does it persist? Is the question.
I think we could fairly say we don't have a lot of research. We have some rough opinions, and even in Richard Florida, he's changed from book to book and page to page in the same book, meaning that this is a hot area, as you're mentioning with the sports teams examples. Cities, governments, corporations, venture capitalists are investing hundreds of millions of dollars, but we have a small amount of knowledge as to where to do it and why. So, I mean, two hypotheses are it's the amount of generalizability of the product, or it's something about the aesthetic judgment. But if we could get more evidence about where and why those respectively work, that would be important for basic science and for location of, matching up the tastes and making people more satisfied, as well as not having developers or sports team managers go bankrupt because they made a mistake in terms of not matching residents or potential residents with what they built.
Yeah.
But
so in that case, it's not as much kind of the contents of that category. We were talking earlier about the kind of generalizability of that coding process. It's not about the contents, it's about kind of the social cognition of if there is a stable kind of unit of analysis, how many people are buying into that, and is it actually driving behavior? And so I'm proposing right now to do a postdoc where I would hopefully be doing that side, the kind of consumer side. So people who go to museums, what is it that you like about what you're seeing? What is it that you don't like? To get a little bit more like cognitive about it.
I presented these ideas and had a number of people, critique or say it's the one or it's the other or whatever, and then we tried to have discussions. For instance, in the film industry capital of Los Angeles, I made the point that people may be more sensitive to film and film-like drama and style, and maybe glamour. Is glamour more salient in LA? And when I presented this to economists and Marxist geographers and Marxist sociologists, they all said, you're wrong. LA is no different than any other capitalist city, and the film industry is just another business. And for instance, you can tell that because if you look on the weekend or where these people are when they're not in the film industry, even though they get dressed up to go to the film industries when they're making the film, at home on the weekend they're like anybody else in Chicago, New York, or wherever. Okay, so that was their assertion. Okay, after hearing that, I said, how can we look at this? So we discussed a little bit then, but afterward, if you look at things like examples that are not people going to work, but are in LA, I looked through our list of 400 amenities and I found one. Children clothing stores. How many children clothing stores are there in LA, New York, Chicago, and some other cities per say compared to all stores? LA has something like 3 times as many children clothing stores as New York and Chicago. That is, so these are not children going to the MGM studio. this supports the argument that there are more people in LA who think I want me and my children to be glamorous, and I want them to have nice little dresses that are chosen from a children's clothing store, not taken off the rack at Target because they're cheaper and simpler. Okay, so that's that. I mean, I'm not saying this is fully right or wrong. I'm saying what I'm trying to illustrate here is a way of looking for a testing of two competing interpretations. And you can use the amenities like a children's clothing store or something else, but look for a bigger theory, such as Whitney's articulated, and how could we differentially test the theory in ways that we could use some of these kinds of data in ways that will answer our questions about which sports team, St. Pete or Tampa, etc. More? Anything more you want to mention on your gentrification and or your more current work? That is your say. How about Wicker Park? That is, I mean, the gentrification is a widely used term, but it's usually used loosely and not very systematically. So her MA went further, and it's been followed up now by others, such as Jeff Parker's doing a PhD. Okay, before them, now I should mention, on the reading list we have Richard Lloyd, a book called Neo-Bohemia. Anybody want to tell us anything about Neo-Bohemia and what it has to say in terms of this discussion? Okay, it's written about the main. You stay here too. No, stay here too. We'll try to keep you involved. Mm-hmm. But just a little, because this is your idea. Neo-Bohemia is a study of the Wicker Park neighborhood of Chicago, which was the main artist neighborhood of Chicago at 10 to 20 years ago. And so Lloyd studied how it was not an artist neighborhood 20 years ago. It was a low middle income Italian, Mexican, Polish neighborhood without very much distinctive style. Then one or two people moved in, and they were sitting in a restaurant together, and a couple of them realized that they were both artists or they were both musicians. And so they said, hey. And then a cafe started to appeal to these, and these folks began to congregate in a cafe. Then they started to form bands. Then it got picked up. There was a reality TV show nationally that was filmed here every week for a year or so. And so then one of the bands composed a couple of recordings and records where it was written up in music magazines. I think it was Rolling Stone. So this is one of the hot neighborhoods in the world, and etc. So it became a hot artist neighborhood very fast. It went up very fast, but it also had bohemianism. And so Rich Lloyd started doing what he called a descriptive ethnography. He did an MA initially, then he's working on the PhD. We had many discussions. And so initially, I'm just describing what's going on in the neighborhood. I said, don't you need a bigger interpretation? And what's your competing interpretations of what's happening and why? So then he did the PhD, then he revised the PhD for 2 or 3 years, and it's now published, revised further 2 or 3 years after. But it's a bestseller. It's a very successful study, and it has some bigger ideas, such as trying to say where and how does. And for you Chinese or you Asians who've never heard of Bohemia in general, this gives you the background, the history, the background of the idea of Bohemia, from Paris to Greenwich Village to Wicker Park and many other artist neighborhoods in the West. And in terms of just extracting the gentrification kind of point, he makes the point that the artists are there at the beginning, and they help to make the neighborhood become not only artistic, but also bohemian. And bohemian for him and for many in this Parisian 19th century sense, say the poet Baudelaire wrote a fair amount about what is bohemian. Verdi did an opera, etc. La Bohème and Puccini. Okay, but Puccini taken from a French bestseller story, etc. about the neighborhood in Paris, etc. So that is, the concept is fairly clear. in that context, and it still is the main way that the term is used. Okay, I'm elaborating this to say we have, in a sense, two potential drivers. Artist occupation, where you may produce an artistic product that may be looked at, especially if it's say digital, and you can send it out over the internet. Or you may have something which is changing the neighborhood to become more aesthetic. And both happened in Wicker Park, and Rich Lloyd writes about both of these. Okay, as prices went then up, and this is the gentrification story, that they start low, they go up for certain reasons, not necessarily, but sometimes artist related. Then they get so high that they may drive out the artists and other kinds of people like your doctors and stockbrokers and professionals move in. But what's different in what I'm trying to add to your story, at least as you told it here very briefly, what's different about those doctors and stockbrokers that may move into Wicker Park from other stockbrokers and lawyers?
That's a great question. That's not something I've studied. But he kind of, I think, in his model, he puts them all together, right? That there are these certain professions that are all creatively minded and innovative, but there are differences among doctors.
Okay, but see, we put our finger on something that Florida, who helped develop this theory, I mean, he took it from a lot of other people, but he really popularized, he stressed the idea of creativity as a driver. Mm-hmm. And so you put your finger well on the point that he does not discuss, in much of the book, the first book, The Rise of the Creative Class, the specific tastes or aesthetics. He leaves it out. Or attitudes more generally, he left out. I mean, I argued with him when he was writing the book and then afterward and so forth. I said, you ought to have some evidence of what's in people's heads. Why do they want to go there? What makes them distinctive in terms of taste and so forth? No. All we want is a census data. What's their job? That's all we want. And so that is, he didn't just say, oh, we can't get that. He said, we don't want it. And so okay. But and I say that because he changed. And one, he changed, and two, it's important if we then look at the follow-up. Let me finish this and then talk a little bit. That is, the follow-up is Jeff Parker's doing a PhD. After many of the artists have been driven out of Wicker Park, he's interviewing the shopkeepers. And he's saying, what kind of clothes are you stocking in your stores here in Wicker Park now? And the answer is, most of them say, we want bohemian, cool, hip styles because that's the definition of Wicker Park. And we have implicitly people who are stockbrokers and doctors and lawyers who are more cool, more hip, and they may be doctors and lawyers, but they're not the same as the doctors and lawyers in Lincoln Park or Winnetka. And so in that sense, the distinctive, the aesthetic of Bohemia may have been transformed within the neighborhood and persist there, even if the money, the jobs, does not permit the artist to afford it, but they brought Bohemia, and Bohemia is still there. Okay, so that's a different way of framing the gentrification story. So reactions to any of that?
I mean, it just seems like there's, dialectic would be two, but a three-way relationship between the kind of economic development, actual businesses, the residents, and then kind of the identity or like the beliefs about the neighborhood by the residents, by the rest of the city. So like you think that this is a cool place, so therefore the amenities there have to like respond to that. Maybe it attracts residents who have a similar aesthetic or just like value judgment. Because I think it's a value judgment in Bohemia that it's like something both artistic and transgressive, and kind of it's a complicated index.
They also persist in having, I think, every Saturday night, maybe once a month or twice a month, and a couple of major buildings where they have, maybe 100 artists' galleries. So the artists are then selling their work, even if they can't afford to live there. They still come to this gallery, and that brings people from all over Chicago and outside Chicago to keep coming back, and they are dressed in a cool, gay, hip style on those nights. Yes.
Just now, you keep mentioning like transgressiveness, so
just a little louder.
You keep mentioning transgressiveness. So do you see a connection between gentrification and like transgressiveness and
Well, for Florida, that's part of the Bohemian. Well, also for Richard Lloyd, that's part of the Bohemian kind of index, or the Bohemian taste. That's different than artistry. So like people can be artists who are not necessarily transgressive, but there's something else that's like breaking social norms, maybe like kind of adopting poverty aesthetically or something like that. People talk about that in like French Bohemia. Yeah.
Long hair, bright colors, etc. More makeup, green and yellow hair. This is for the Chinese. One last question or comment? Observation. Okay. Thank you. We will end today. Thank you, Whitney.
Yeah.
And Christina. Lots of tech support today.